There is a kind of disappointment a man can carry for years without saying it out loud. From the outside, his life may not look broken. He may still be ambitious, still intelligent, still capable of seriousness, still respected enough by other people, but privately. He knows something is unstable. Too many days depend on how he feels. Too many mornings begin with a standard in front of him, but weak command behind it. Too many hours get lost, not because the work is unclear, but because something softer inside him keeps delaying the moment of obedience. And after a while, that does something to a man. Not only to his output, not only to his schedule, to his relationship with himself. Because the deepest burden is not always that he falls behind. Sometimes the deeper burden is that he no longer fully trusts the person he becomes. When discomfort enters the room, he knows what matters. He just does not always know which version of himself will show up to carry it. One version plans with conviction. Another version hesitates in silence. One version speaks about standards. Another version quietly lowers them when the state changes. That is where this begins. Because this is no longer a motivation problem. It is no longer a matter of waiting for the right spark, the right mood, the right burst of energy, or the right sense of inner clarity. This is a rulership problem. Who leads when discomfort enters? Who leads when the body feels heavy, when the mind feels crowded, when the task looks demanding, when the day has already gone sideways before it properly began? Does mood lead or does standard lead? That question sounds small. It is not. It reaches into the way a man wakes up, the way he works, the way he trains, the way he keeps promises, the way he carries responsibility when the emotional weather inside him is not cooperative. A lot of men still think discipline is mainly a feeling problem. They think they need to feel more inspired, more driven, more mentally clean, more on. But the deeper truth is, this discipline gets easier the moment you stop treating action like a feeling problem and start treating it like an identity problem. Because once identity enters, the whole field changes. The question is no longer, how do I get myself to feel better so I can act? The question becomes, what kind of man is in command here? A mood-led man can still have good intentions. He can still want a better life. He can still dream in strong language on a Sunday night. But when Monday pressure comes, or Tuesday fatigue, or Wednesday disappointment, those intentions lose structure, and life starts taking its shape from something unstable. That is why this matters. Not because you need more hype, not because you need another system to admire for 3 days and abandon on the 4th. It matters because a man who gives command to mood will eventually make his own life feel heavier than it needs to be. Not always dramatic, not always obvious, but heavy. Heavy because too much gets reopened. Heavy because too much depends on state. Heavy because too many important things have to wait for internal agreement. Before they are allowed to move, a man becomes lighter the moment he stops asking his mood to authorize his standards. And once he sees that, he stops blaming the wrong weakness. Chapter 1. The pain of not trusting yourself. The pain is not always loud. It does not always look like collapse. It does not always look like failure in the obvious sense. Sometimes it looks like this. A man makes plans he means. He sets standards he actually believes in. He speaks to himself in a serious voice about the life he wants to build. He writes things down. He organizes. He resets. He promises himself that this time the week will look different, and for a moment, it feels true. Then the state changes. The sleep was poor. The morning feels heavy. The phone gets touched too early. The mind gets noisy before the first real hour has even begun. The task that looked clear the night before now feels harder to obey. And suddenly, the standard starts bending. Not because he no longer believes in it, not because it stopped mattering, but because the version of him now standing inside the day is weaker than the version who made the plan. That is where the pain begins to deepen. Because the pain is not only that he delays, the pain is that he starts losing trust in his own continuity. He does not know whether the man who speaks with conviction at night will still be the man who acts with conviction in the morning. He does not know whether the standard is real, or only real while the emotional weather is favorable, and that uncertainty cuts deeper than most men admit, because ambition without reliability is a painful thing. A man can endure a lot when he knows he can trust himself. He can endure long days. He can endure slow progress. He can endure boredom, repetition, discomfort, even failure. But what begins to wear him down is something more private. It is the feeling that his words no longer carry full weight with himself. He says he will wake earlier. Sometimes he does. Sometimes he does not. He says he will train. Sometimes he trains. Sometimes he debates. He says he will protect the important block of work. But then the inbox opens first. The tabs multiply. The morning gets scattered. And by noon, the day already belongs to weaker priorities. He says he will handle the hard conversation, but the timing never feels right. His inner weather feels off, so it moves again and again from the outside. These may look like small failures. Inside a man, repeated small failures do something cumulative. They reduce the weight of his own voice. That is why unstable follow-through hurts more than people think. It does not only damage productivity, it damages self-respect. Because self-respect is not built only from ideals. It is built from evidence, from seeing that the standard survives contact with ordinary days, from seeing that the rule still stands when the body is tired, when the mind is crowded, when the mood is not generous. Without that evidence, a strange sadness enters a man's life. He may still talk about the future with conviction, but underneath that, he begins carrying doubt. Not doubt about whether the goal matters, doubt about whether he can trust the self that must carry it. That is why the most painful part is not the missed morning, not the delayed task, not the skipped workout, not even the important work pushed later again. While the day fills with smaller things, the more painful part is the private humiliation of instability. He becomes someone who keeps needing to be reconvinced, someone whose standards rise and fall with state, someone whose seriousness can be interrupted by mood, someone respected in his ambitions by other people, but privately disappointed in the weakness of his own follow-through. And after enough repetitions, that disappointment becomes heavier than the tasks themselves. Sunday night becomes charged with intention. Tuesday night becomes heavy with self-betrayal. He sees the gap. He feels the gap. He lives inside the gap between the man he keeps describing and the man who actually appears when discomfort enters. That gap is exhausting because it means every plan carries a shadow. Every fresh start carries suspicion. Every reset has to fight the memory of earlier collapses. Ambition feels noble until it keeps living inside a man you cannot fully trust. And that is the wound beneath the wound. A man can survive slowness. What wears him down is inconsistency in the self that must carry responsibility. So yes, delay hurts, but self-doubt built by repeated delay hurts deeper. And the private humiliation is not only the missed task, it is the unstable self. The pain is not only that he delays, the pain is that he cannot fully trust the man he becomes when the mood changes. That is only the visible layer of the problem. Beneath it sits a chain of command. Chapter 2. The Hidden Enemy. Emotional Obedience. Beneath it sits a chain of command, and most men never name it correctly. They feel the consequences of it. They live inside the drag of it. They keep suffering under it, but they rarely call it by its real name, because there is a kind of weakness modern men do not like to admit in themselves. Not open cowardice, not obvious laziness, not a total lack of ambition, something quieter than that, something more acceptable, more internal, more disguised. It is emotional obedience. That phrase may sound severe, but it names something real. A man can feel tired without being weak. He can feel discouraged without being broken. He can feel frustrated, distracted, disappointed, heavy, overstimulated, uncertain. None of that, by itself, is the enemy. Feeling is not the enemy. Mood is part of human experience. Fatigue is real. Discomfort is real. Inner resistance is real. The problem begins when those things stop being part of the experience and start becoming part of the command structure. That is where the damage begins. Not when mood speaks, when mood leads. Because many men do not refuse responsibility in a direct way. They do something softer. They wait for internal agreement. They wait to feel clearer. They wait to feel more settled. They wait to feel more willing. They wait to feel more like themselves. And while they wait, life keeps moving. The work remains. The body remains. The standard remains. But command has quietly been handed to a weaker authority. That is what emotional obedience is. It is not screaming, "I will not do it." It is more subtle than that. It sounds like, "I will do it when I feel better. I will handle it when my head is right. I will move when the mood lines up. I will show up when I feel more ready internally." That language sounds harmless. Sometimes it even sounds self-aware, but beneath it is a dangerous arrangement. The standard is no longer leading. Feeling is, and once that happens, a man's life becomes weather-shaped. If the internal weather is clear, he moves. If the internal weather is heavy, he bends. If the state is favorable, the standard looks real. If the state turns dark, the standard begins to negotiate with the day. That is a fragile way to live, because mood was never built to govern. Mood can report. Mood can signal. Mood can tell the truth about what the body feels, what the mind is carrying, what the nervous system is processing. But mood was not meant to sit in the chair of command. When it does, ordinary duty starts feeling negotiable. The workout becomes optional. The hard file becomes something to circle around. The important conversation gets postponed because the inner weather does not feel right for honesty. The deep work block opens, but the mind reaches for something easier first, because the task does not yet feel emotionally approved. This is why some men sit in the car outside the gym for 12 extra minutes. Not because they have made a real decision, but because they are still waiting for feeling to ratify action. This is why a man opens the file that matters, stares at it, then closes it again because he is not in the right headspace. This is why a needed conversation gets moved to another day, then another, because the state never seems quite correct for discomfort. Men rarely call this obedience, but that is exactly what it becomes. Not obedience to truth, not obedience to duty, not obedience to a chosen standard, obedience to internal weather. And the cost of that arrangement is larger than most men admit, because a mood-led man may still sound serious. He may still speak in the language of growth. He may still admire discipline. He may still believe in high standards. But if his action keeps waiting for emotional permission, then his identity remains unstable under pressure. He becomes a man whose life can be interrupted by feeling too easily, a man whose standards remain sincere, but weak in authority, a man whose duty must keep reintroducing itself to him every time the state changes. That is exhausting. And it is dangerous to self-respect, because over time, the man starts adapting not to what matters, but to what his inner weather will currently allow. He does not notice the shift at first. Few men do. They simply begin organizing their standards around emotional cooperation. They move when they feel clear. They obey when they feel strong. They show up when the state matches the standard. That is mood-led identity. And the deeper problem is not only that it slows action, it makes action fragile. It means the standard is never fully standing on its own. It is always leaning on mood for authorization. And anything that leans on mood that heavily will eventually shake, because mood changes, energy changes, mental weather changes, the inner climate of a man can shift before noon. If command shifts with it, reliability never becomes identity. It remains a temporary arrangement between the standard and the state. That is too weak a structure for a serious life. An identity built around emotional obedience will always make action fragile. Once a man sees that, something important becomes possible. He stops romanticizing his inconsistency. He stops calling it sensitivity. He stops mistaking it for complexity. He stops describing the problem in language that keeps the enemy hidden. And once you name the enemy correctly, you stop blaming the wrong weakness. Chapter 3. The Misreading. And once you name the enemy correctly, you stop blaming the wrong weakness. That matters more than most men realize, because a great deal of suffering is prolonged by misreading. A man feels unstable. He feels disappointed in himself. He feels the drag of inconsistency. He sees the gap between what he says matters and what actually gets carried. And because that gap is painful, he begins searching for an explanation. Usually, he does not search in the right place. He tells himself he needs more motivation, more inspiration, a cleaner morning, a better system, a stronger reset, a new source of energy that will finally make obedience feel easier. Sometimes he tells himself he simply needs to get back in the zone. That phrase sounds familiar, because it is familiar. Many men have spent years trying to repair their lives by chasing a better internal state. They think if the feeling improves, the action will stabilize. If the mood improves, the standard will become easier to carry. If the mind becomes clearer, the work will finally move in a serious way. But the deeper truth is this: that diagnosis is wrong. Not completely wrong, Not useless in every sense, but wrong at the level that matters most. Because this is not mainly a motivation problem. Motivation rises and falls. It always has, it always will. A man can feel strongly moved on Sunday night and strangely flat on Tuesday morning. He can feel ambitious after a setback, after a moment of clarity, after a wave of self-disgust. But what rises that easily also falls that easily. So motivation may speak, it may energize, it may help begin certain things, but it was never built to govern a serious life. And the problem is not mainly a knowledge problem either. Many men already know enough. They know they should sleep earlier. They know they should protect the first work block. They know the phone steals the morning. They know training matters. They know hard things should be touched before the day gets crowded. They know avoidance compounds. They know drift has a price. They know all of that. And still, they do not live under the full authority of what they know. That should tell a man something, because if knowledge were enough, far more men would already be free. A man can read enough, highlight enough, save enough clips, collect enough frameworks, listen to enough long conversations about discipline, focus, self-respect, masculine responsibility, inner order, and still lose the day by 10:30 in the morning, still touch the phone too early, still circle the hard file, still let easier tasks consume the first clean hours, still postpone the conversation that requires steadiness. That is why misreading is expensive. It keeps a man trying to upgrade the wrong thing. He thinks he needs more fire, but fire is not command. He thinks he needs more information, but information does not self-execute. He thinks he needs the perfect routine, but even a strong routine collapses in the hands of a man who keeps giving final authority to mood. This is the deeper truth. The issue is not whether mood exists. The issue is whether mood gets command. And the issue is not whether discomfort appears. The issue is who rules when it does. That is the part many men keep missing. Because discomfort has a way of distorting diagnosis. When the work feels heavy, a man assumes he lacks energy. When the task feels resistant, he assumes he lacks clarity. When the day feels scattered, he assumes he needs a better plan. When he breaks his own standard again, he assumes he needs a stronger emotional reason. Sometimes he does need rest. Sometimes he does need recovery. Sometimes he does need simplification. But beneath all that, the central question remains untouched. Who governs the self when internal weather turns bad? That is the real diagnostic question. Not, how do I feel today? Not how inspired am I? Not, do I currently have momentum? But who is in command when the state turns difficult? Because a man can have knowledge without rulership. He can have desire without rulership. He can have talent without rulership. He can have potential without rulership. And all of it will still collapse on bad days. Knowledge without rulership still bends. Motivation without rulership still fades. Potential without rulership still leaks. That is why some of the most frustrated men are not the least capable men. They are often men who know enough to see the standard clearly, but do not yet have a stable chain of command beneath it. They can describe the life they want. They can explain the logic. They can hear truth and recognize it instantly. But recognition is not rulership. Understanding is not command. Until that becomes clear, A man keeps trying to solve a structural problem with emotional upgrades. He keeps trying to feel his way into order. That rarely works for long, because mood shifts, energy shifts, pressure shifts, sleep shifts. The day itself begins applying force before the man has fully settled into it. If the standard depends on a favorable state, the standard is already weak. That is why knowledge cannot protect a man who keeps reopening the rule, and motivation cannot save a man who keeps handing authority to discomfort. What looks emotional on the surface is often structural underneath. What looks like laziness is sometimes misruled identity. What looks like low drive is sometimes low command. What looks like inconsistency is often a private leadership problem inside the self. That is the reframe. The problem is not simply that a man has moods. The problem is that he has let them sit too close to the center of decision. The issue is not whether mood exists. The issue is whether mood gets command. And once that becomes clear, the answer is no longer emotional. It becomes structural. Chapter 4, the Doctrine Stack enters, and once that becomes clear, the answer is no longer emotional. It becomes structural. That is where many men begin to resist again. Because structure sounds less exciting than inspiration, less cinematic than breakthrough, less emotionally satisfying than the fantasy of finally feeling ready enough to become consistent. But a serious life is not stabilized by exciting ideas. It is stabilized by governing principles. A man does not become reliable because he finally has a better week. He does not become reliable because he catches the right mood and rides it longer. He becomes reliable when something deeper takes shape beneath his days, when his life begins to rest on order instead of weather. That is where doctrine enters, not as decoration, not as a clever sentence to admire, not as a quote to repeat while nothing underneath it changes. Doctrine, in the serious sense, is a law that simplifies command, a law that reduces drift, a law that survives bad mornings, a law that keeps working when the emotional climate is not kind. That matters because a man cannot rebuild himself from scratch every morning. He cannot keep asking feeling to approve what responsibility already requires. He cannot keep treating standards like suggestions that become real only when the state is favorable. That is too fragile a structure for a serious life. So, once the misreading is broken, the next question becomes obvious. What restores command? What gives order more authority than mood? What keeps action from becoming emotional every time discomfort appears? The deeper truth is this. There are 3 laws that begin rebuilding a man from the inside out, not because they remove discomfort, not because they make mood disappear, but because they place leadership back where it belongs. The first law is this: standards beat mood. The second, reliable men move before they feel ready. And the third, decisions made early protect later action. Those 3 laws are simple enough to say quickly, but they are not light. Each one corrects a different weakness. The first corrects drift. The second corrects hesitation. The third corrects repeated internal debate. Together, they create a structure that can survive contact with ordinary life. Because that is where discipline is usually lost, not in rare crises, not in dramatic failure, in ordinary mornings, ordinary afternoons, ordinary moments when the day presses against the man and asks a quiet question. Who leads here? If the answer keeps changing with mood. Self-trust never hardens, but if the answer begins to rest on doctrine, something inside the man becomes steadier, not louder, not more theatrical, steadier. That is the point. A serious man does not need a life that feels intense all the time. He needs a life that holds, and lives hold through structure. Think about what these three laws actually do. A standard gives the day a rail. Movement gives the standard proof. An early decision protects both from later weakness. That is their relationship. The standard tells the man what rules. Movement keeps the rule from becoming theory. Early decision keeps a weaker version of the self from reopening what should already be settled. This is not shallow restriction. It is protection. Protection from drift. Protection from bad mornings. Protection from internal weather becoming a daily authority. That is why a fixed training day matters. A protected work block matters. A visible rule matters. A boundary decided before the day turns difficult matters. Not because these things are magical, because they reduce the number of places where mood gets to pretend it should have a vote. A rule is often kinder than a debate. Reliable men do not build their lives from scratch every morning. They inherit their day from decisions already made, and that inheritance changes the weight of living. Because once a man understands doctrine this way, discipline stops feeling like a personality trait he either has or does not have. It becomes architecture, and architecture matters most when weather changes. That is why this next turn matters so much. A man who wants to trust himself again must stop asking for a better mood and start building better laws. He must stop hoping the right feeling will carry him and begin choosing principles that can carry him when feeling does not. A decision made early is one of the strongest forms of self-protection a man can build. Start with the first law. It is heavier than it sounds. Chapter 5. Doctrine. One standards beat mood. Start with the first law. It is heavier than it sounds, because most men hear the word standards and think of pressure. They think of perfection. They think of rigidity. They think of another harsh voice demanding more from them when they already feel tired. But that is not the meaning here. A standard, in the serious sense, is not performance theater. It is not self-punishment. It is not a dramatic identity statement spoken in a strong tone and forgotten 3 days later. A standard is simpler than that. It is a line decided before the day begins arguing. A rule that does not need fresh emotion in order to become real. A visible minimum that survives contact with ordinary life. That matters because mood-based living creates drift, not always collapse, more often, drift. A man wakes with one intention, then slowly leans away from it in small permissions. The phone first, the hard task later, the workout maybe, the sleep boundary loosened, the important conversation pushed because the emotional weather feels poor. None of those moments seem fatal by themselves, but together, they create a life that keeps sliding off its own rails. That is what standards interrupt. A standard puts a rail under the day. It tells a man, before the mind gets noisy, what still stands. It tells him before fatigue begins negotiating. What does not need to be reopened. It tells him. Before mood starts presenting its case, where authority already rests, that is why standards reduce drift. Not because they make a man feel better, because they remove some of the places where feeling gets to pretend it should decide. A standard says the first work block is protected, not if the mood is clean, not if inspiration arrives on time, not if the mind feels bright enough to be proud of the effort. Protected. A standard says training belongs on certain days, not when the emotional weather becomes favorable, not when the body feels noble, not when self-respect has been freshly wounded and needs a dramatic comeback story. On certain days, a standard says the phone does not get the first clean minutes of the morning. Not because the phone is evil, because the mind is still unformed in those early moments. And command should not be handed away before the day has properly begun. A standard says sleep has a line, the day has a line, the work has a line, and those lines matter because without them, everything becomes too interpretive. That is one of the hidden costs of mood-led living, too much interpretation. How do I feel about it today? Do I want to do it now? Am I mentally ready? Would tomorrow be cleaner? A mood-led man asks these questions too often, and every extra question weakens command a little more, because action becomes emotional, long before it becomes physical. A standard cuts through that, not by making life robotic, by making ordinary duty less dramatic. That is one of the quiet gifts of standards. They remove unnecessary theater from responsibility. A standard removes drama from ordinary duty. The man does not need to wake up heroic in order to keep a simple rule. He does not need to be brilliant on a bad day. He does not need to defeat every form of resistance before earning the right to act. He only needs the baseline to remain visible, and that is why standards simplify bad days. A bad day does not require genius. It requires less leakage. A bad day does not ask a man to become his strongest self. It asks him not to abandon the rail. That difference matters. Because many men fail bad days by trying to win them in a dramatic way. Usually that does not hold. What holds is something quieter. A baseline, a visible rule, a protected minimum, a line that says even here. This still stands. The morning may feel foggy, the body may feel flat, the mind may feel crowded, the energy may not be generous, but the rail still exists. That is what gives a man a way to move through imperfect days, without constantly renegotiating his own seriousness. Bad days become less destructive when the baseline is already decided. That line matters because destruction rarely begins in one catastrophic failure. More often, it begins in daily erosion. Standards slow erosion. They keep a man from sliding as far. Just because the state changed. And over time. That does something important to self-respect, because self-respect is not only built by intensity, it is built by legibility, by becoming readable to yourself in the right ways, by knowing that certain things do not need to be rediscovered every morning, by knowing that your conduct does not fully depend on the weather inside you. That is one of the deepest comforts a serious man can build. Not comfort as softness, comfort as order. The man with standards spends less life redeciding himself. That alone reduces burden. It reduces mental drag. It reduces internal voting. It reduces the quiet humiliation of watching the self become negotiable every time mood darkens. And this matters. A standard does not need to be perfect to be powerful. It does not need to be extreme. It does not need to impress anyone. It does not need to sound like a speech. It needs to be clear enough that the day recognizes it. A clear bedtime band, a fixed training rhythm. A first work block that belongs to what matters most. A rule that hard tasks get touched before the day gets crowded. A rule that the morning is not surrendered to noise. These are not glamorous things. That is part of their power, because a serious life is usually lost in unglamorous places, and it is rebuilt there too. Standards are what remain when excitement leaves the room. That is why they matter so much. Excitement is welcome when it comes. Motivation is welcome when it comes. A clear inner state is welcome when it comes. But none of them can be allowed to outrank the rule, because the man who lives by standards lives less at the mercy of interpretation. He knows what stands, and because he knows what stands, something inside him stops drifting so easily. That is the first law. Not glamorous, not loud, but heavy. Standards keep moving when mood wants to pause, but standards still get misunderstood. If a man believes movement must wait for alignment. Chapter 6. Doctrine. Two reliable men move before they feel ready. But standards still get misunderstood. If a man believes movement must wait for alignment, that misunderstanding costs more than most men realize, because a man can agree with standards in theory, admire them in language, even build them into the architecture of his week, and still remain weaker than he thinks. If he quietly assumes one thing, that action should begin only after the feeling becomes cooperative, that is where many serious men lose force. Not because they reject the standard, not because they no longer care, not because they secretly want a small life. They lose force because they keep asking for emotional agreement before first contact. And that sounds more reasonable than it is. A man tells himself he will move once the mind clears a little more, once the body feels less resistant, once the task feels less heavy in the hand, once the inner weather becomes cleaner, calmer, more supportive. He is not refusing, he is waiting. But when that waiting becomes habitual, it creates a dangerous pattern. The standard remains respected in language, yet movement remains delayed in practice. That gap matters, because reliable men are not built by inner agreement first. They are built by contact. That is the second law. Reliable men do not need the whole self to feel aligned, before they begin obeying what already matters. They do not require perfect emotional unity before they make first contact with duty. They open the file, they make the call. They walk into the gym, they sit down for the first work block. They begin the conversation. They touch the task before the mood has fully agreed to escort them there. That movement may look small from the outside. It is not. Because the first proof of reliability is not brilliance, it is contact. That line matters because many men still imagine reliability in dramatic terms. They imagine a disciplined man as someone who always feels powerful, always knows exactly what to do, always moves with clean certainty. But mature action is usually less cinematic than that. It is quieter. It often begins while the mind is still noisy, while resistance is still present, while the task still feels somewhat unfriendly, while the emotional climate inside the man is not yet generous. That does not mean the man is broken. It means he is human. And a grown man does not need perfect inner weather to make first contact with duty. That is one of the most important shifts in this entire video, because once a man understands that, he stops treating motion as the reward for feeling good enough. He stops making emotional readiness the gatekeeper of responsibility. He stops assuming that clarity must come first in complete form. Sometimes clarity comes through movement. Sometimes willingness comes after contact. Sometimes a task feels less impossible, only after the man has already entered it. That is why movement before full clarity matters so much. Not because confusion is noble, not because uncertainty is ideal, but because life often does not grant full emotional agreement. Before obedience is required, a man may not feel ready to make the call, but the call still matters. He may not feel internally clean enough to open the hard project, but the project still belongs to him. He may not feel drawn toward training after a long day, but the body still keeps its account. He may not feel emotionally settled enough to have the honest conversation, but delay still has consequences. That is where reliable men separate from unstable ones, not in the absence of resistance, in what they do while resistance is still present. A weaker man waits for the emotional vote to come in. A stronger man respects the rule before he enjoys the feeling. That is not self-violence, it is maturity. That distinction matters, because this doctrine can be misunderstood by men who are already tired, already harsh with themselves, already tempted to turn every truth into another excuse for self-attack. That is not the point here. The point is simpler and heavier than that. Do not hand final command to temporary reluctance. Do not assume that because a task feels emotionally expensive, it should remain untouched. Do not let discomfort become the authority that decides whether first contact happens. Reliable action is repeated action under imperfect feeling, not ideal feeling, not fully supportive feeling, not emotionally beautiful feeling, imperfect feeling. That is what makes it reliable. Because if action only appears when the internal state is favorable, then what looks like discipline is still too dependent on weather. A serious man cannot build his life on that. He needs something steadier, and that steadiness begins the moment he stops asking, "Do I fully feel like entering this?" and starts asking, "Can I make first contact now?" That question is smaller, but it is stronger. Because first contact breaks the spell of distance. The unopened file is heavy in one way. An opened file is heavy in another. The untouched conversation is heavy in one way. A conversation begun is heavy in another. The gym bag in the passenger seat after a long day carries one kind of burden. Walking through the door carries another. And often the second burden is cleaner than the first. Movement often earns the feeling that waiting never produced. That is why so many men keep misjudging the early moment. They think the work will become possible once the mood improves. Often the mood improves only after the work has been touched. Not always, not perfectly, but often enough that a man should stop treating emotional readiness as a prerequisite for obedience. Reliable men learn this. They learn that beginning the first 20 minutes matters more than admiring the perfect future version of the session. They learn that sending the message matters more than rehearsing a cleaner inner state. They learn that sitting down matters more than waiting for flow. And over time, that changes identity. Because a man starts gathering a different kind of evidence. Evidence not that he always feels strong, but that he can still move while feeling imperfect. That is strength in a more serious form. Not loud strength, not theatrical strength. Usable strength, the kind that shows up on ordinary days. The kind that keeps a life from leaking away in hesitation. The kind that makes a man more trustworthy to himself, because he no longer requires ideal conditions to make honest contact with what matters. And that is the second law in its clearest form. Reliable men do not wait to feel aligned. They move until alignment catches up. And even that becomes easier when a weaker version of the self is given fewer editing rights. Chapter 7. Doctrine 3. Decide early reduce debate. And even that becomes easier when a weaker version of the self is given fewer editing rights. That line matters because many men are more tired than they need to be. Not only tired from work, not only tired from pressure, not only tired from carrying responsibility through an already demanding life, tired from debate, tired from reopening, tired from internal voting, tired from having to persuade themselves again and again, to do what should already have the weight of a settled rule. This is one of the most overlooked drains in a man's life. He thinks the burden is the task. Often the burden is the repeated argument before the task. He thinks the exhaustion comes from action. Often the exhaustion begins earlier than action. In the private chamber where the standard keeps getting brought back to the table, as if it were still undecided. That is why the third law matters so much. A stronger man decides earlier, so that a weaker version of himself has less authority later. This is not only a productivity principle, it is a principle of command. Because decision timing matters. When a rule is decided late, it meets more resistance. When a rule is decided in the moment, it meets more negotiation. When a rule is left open until the day has already become emotionally expensive, it enters the fight at its weakest point. That is what many men keep doing to themselves without realizing it. They do not decide upstream. They leave too much open. They leave wake time open. They leave the first work block open. They leave training open. They leave sleep boundaries open. They leave phone boundaries open. They leave hard conversations open. Then the day becomes heavy. The mind becomes noisy. The body becomes reluctant. The inbox fills. The schedule tilts. The emotional weather thickens. And only then do they ask the self to decide. That is expensive, because a standard asked to win in the middle of pressure is already entering the fight late. A man becomes lighter when he stops putting every standard up for vote. That is one of the quiet forms of relief this doctrine offers. Not relief as softness, relief as reduced friction. Pre-commitment is not glamorous language, but it describes something powerful. What is decided once costs less later. What is settled upstream bleeds less energy downstream. That is why a rule decided early protects a man from having to become heroic on ordinary days. He does not need to redecide whether the first clean hour belongs to shallow noise or important work. He does not need to redecide whether training is a real part of his week. He does not need to redecide whether the phone gets to touch his mind before he has touched his own priorities. He does not need to redecide whether the hard call should be made before noon, or avoided until emotional drag grows thicker around it. The rule already exists, and because it already exists, command no longer has to be rebuilt in the middle of resistance. That is mercy toward the future self. Pre-commitment is mercy toward your future weaker self. That line matters because many men still think freedom means leaving everything emotionally open. It does not. That kind of openness often becomes leakage. A serious life cannot afford to negotiate every baseline behavior each morning. Some things should not reopen daily. Not because life must become rigid, because command must become clearer. A bedtime ban should not require a fresh philosophical discussion every night. A training rhythm should not need to be emotionally justified every single time. A first work block should not wait for a perfect internal climate before it is allowed to become real. A boundary around noise, distraction, or delay should not need the approval of a tired mind to remain valid. These are not small things. These are the places where identity either leaks or holds. And when a man keeps reopening them, He keeps handing editing rights to the weakest version of himself. That is what must change. The weaker self should not be given authorship. He already has enough voice. He already knows how to plead for delay. He already knows how to sound reasonable while protecting avoidance. So a stronger man decides earlier. He decides while the mind is cleaner, while the standard is visible, while emotional drag has not yet gathered full momentum. He decides upstream, and that upstream decision changes the feel of the whole day. Less friction, less theater, less private negotiation, less quiet leakage of identity through repeated debate. The man who decides upstream bleeds less energy downstream. That is why laying out training clothes the night before matters. Why the first deep work block being fixed matters. Why the phone being out of reach in the first hour matters. Why sleep boundaries and the time for hard calls matter. Not because these details are magical, because they remove the number of places where command has to fight for itself in real time. And a man who lives that way begins to notice something. Life is still demanding. Mood still changes. Discomfort still appears. But the self feels less crowded, less divided, less debated, less noisy in its obedience. A rule decided early protects energy later. That is the real relief. Not the relief of getting out of duty, the relief of no longer having to drag duty through a fresh argument every day. And when those three laws begin to hold together, something deeper begins to change. A man stops looking like someone merely trying to build better habits. He starts becoming someone else, someone quieter, someone steadier, someone whose conduct carries less emotional static. This is where the old identity starts to lose its shape. Chapter 8. Identity Shift. This is where the old identity starts to lose its shape, not all at once, not in some dramatic transformation where a man wakes up one morning and suddenly feels completely remade. Usually it happens more quietly than that. A line holds where it used to bend. A task gets touched where it used to be delayed. A day stays more intact than it used to. A standard survives contact with a tired state, where it once would have collapsed into mood. From the outside, those changes may not look spectacular. Inside a man, they mean everything. Because this is where doctrine stops sounding like an idea and starts becoming identity. This is where the difference between the old self and the new self becomes visible. The old self was not necessarily weak in intention. That is important to say. He may have cared deeply. He may have wanted a serious life. He may have spoken honestly about what mattered. He may have felt shame because he knew he was capable of more. But his rulership was unstable. His mood sat too close to command. His standards rose and fell with state. His self-respect took too many blows from inconsistency. His days contained too much debate, too much reopening, too much emotional permission-seeking before ordinary duty could move. That was the old structure, not evil, not hopeless, but unstable. The new self is not defined by having no emotion. He is defined by stronger command. That distinction matters because many men hear truth like this and secretly imagine the goal is to become colder, harder, and flatter, less human. It is not. The goal is not to become emotionless. The goal is to become led by something stronger than emotion. That is what gives the new identity its weight. He still feels. He still gets tired. He still has resistance. He still has mornings where the body is slow, afternoons where the mind is scattered, evenings where discipline feels less romantic than it did in thought. But those states no longer sit in the center chair. They are part of the experience. They are no longer the author of conduct. That is a different kind of life, a quieter one. A stronger identity is often less dramatic, not more. It talks less, explains less, promises less, restarts less. It simply holds more. That is one of the strongest changes available to a man. Not becoming flashy, becoming trustworthy, trustworthy to other people. Yes, but first, trustworthy to himself, because self-respect rises when a man becomes predictable to himself in the right ways. Not predictable in passivity, not predictable in mediocrity, predictable in standard, predictable in the fact that what matters does not have to win a fresh election every morning. Predictable in the fact that the baseline is real even on less generous days. Predictable in the fact that command stays where it should. That changes the emotional atmosphere of a man's life. He does not need to keep watching himself with suspicion. He does not need to keep wondering which version of him will arrive. He does not need to keep making grand internal speeches. To compensate for weak continuity, he becomes calmer, not because life got easier, because command got cleaner. And that calm has weight. Reliability is one of the quietest forms of masculine weight. People feel it. They may not always have language for it, but they feel it. A reliable man feels less theatrical, less slippery, less dependent on self-description. His life begins to argue for him. The work gets touched. The standard remains visible. The debate gets shorter. The mood no longer writes the rules. That is dignity, not just productivity. This is why the identity shift matters so much, because the old self kept trying to become disciplined, while still organizing life around emotional obedience. The new self becomes standard-led. The old self kept needing the state to cooperate before action could look honest. The new self lets action appear even when the state is imperfect. The old self kept reintroducing duty to himself. The new self inherits duty from decisions already made. The old self lived too close to internal weather. The new self still feels the weather, but no longer serves it. That is the shift. Who he was, who he becomes. A man whose baseline is action, not frantic action, not performative action, not the restless energy of someone trying to outrun self-doubt. Baseline action, steady action, ordered action, action that belongs to a life governed by standards instead of moods. And when that begins to happen, self-respect returns in a deeper form, not as excitement, as quiet evidence, evidence that the self is no longer dissolving so easily under discomfort, evidence that standards do not vanish when the state turns dark, evidence that identity is becoming more legible, more durable, more fit to carry weight. That is what this whole movement has been building toward. Not a better mood, not a better speech, a better ruler. And if that identity is real, it must become visible in the way a man operates on ordinary days. Chapter 9, Operating Rules. And if that identity is real, it must become visible in the way a man operates on ordinary days. Because identity, if it remains only language, is still too fragile. It is too easy to admire, too easy to repeat, too easy to confuse with change. A man does not become different because he has found better words for himself. He becomes different when the day begins to feel different under his rule. That is where operating rules matter. Not as tricks, not as life hacks, not as a fresh collection of productivity advice. for men who are secretly still mood-led. Something more serious than that. Operating rules are where identity becomes executable. They are where a man decides what governs the ordinary, what governs the morning, what governs the first hour, what governs the moment discomfort appears, what governs the day when the mood is thin and the standard is being tested. That is the real proving ground. Not the inspired day, not the day when energy is generous, not the day when clarity comes easily and obedience feels almost natural. The bad day is where identity gets audited. That line matters because many men judge themselves by how they operate when life is cooperative. But that is not the true audit. The true audit comes when the state is poor, when the body is slower than usual, when the mind is crowded, when sleep was weak, when the task feels heavy in the hand, when motivation is absent and the emotional weather offers no assistance. Who governs there? That is where operating rules earn their place. A man who is becoming standard-led begins deciding earlier than mood wants him to. He does not leave the whole day emotionally open. He knows that what matters most should meet as little internal debate as possible. So he decides earlier, not only in principle, in placement. He decides what the first clean block belongs to. He decides what days the body will be trained. He decides what time the night begins closing. He decides what the phone is not allowed to touch too early. He decides what hard thing must be contacted before the day becomes emotionally expensive. That is not rigidity. That is command. And when the day begins, he moves on signal, not feeling. That phrase should be understood carefully, not coldly, not mechanically, not as if a man should stop listening to reality, but as a correction. Signal means the rule is clear. The time is here. The task belongs to this part of the day. The responsibility has already been named. Feeling may still protest. Feeling may still drag its feet. Feeling may still say the weather is wrong. But feeling is no longer the trigger. Signal is that one shift changes a great deal. Because once a man moves on signal, the day becomes less interpretive. There is less waiting, less emotional polling, less wandering around the edge of duty, while hoping the state becomes more cooperative. That is how debate begins to shrink. And it needs to shrink. Because a life with too much private debate becomes heavy very quickly. A man starts spending more energy discussing the rule with himself than carrying it. He starts explaining, delaying, adjusting, reframing what should already have been settled. That is leakage. So the new identity reduces debate wherever it can. Not by becoming numb, by becoming clearer. The standard is visible. The rule is already named. The baseline has already been chosen. That is what cleaner command feels like. And from there, another rule becomes essential. Protect bad day behavior. Not your best day. Your bad day, that is what must be defended, because a man does not build a trustworthy life merely by performing well when he feels sharp. He builds it by refusing to disappear when he does not. The standard on a bad day may look smaller, but it must still be real. The work block may be less brilliant. It should still be touched. The training may be less powerful. The body should still be honored. The mind may be noisier. The first hour should still be protected. The conversation may feel emotionally expensive. It should still move closer instead of farther away. That is how identity becomes durable, not by winning every day beautifully, by not vanishing on difficult ones. And that is why standards must remain visible. A standard no one can see is often a standard no one really kept. That does not mean a man must perform his discipline publicly. It means the rule should not live only in vague intention. Write it, place it, name it. Let the day encounter it in physical form. A line on paper, a rule on the desk, a fixed training rhythm in the calendar, a first block protected before messages and noise, a phone boundary that exists outside wishful thinking, a shutdown line that can actually be recognized when night arrives. Invisible standards dissolve faster. Visible standards press back. They remind the weaker self that authorship has already been claimed. And that is why practical order is not a shallow thing. It answers a moral question. Who leads here? Ordinary days reveal who leads far more than big speeches do. That is why this section matters. Not because operating rules are glamorous, because they expose whether doctrine has actually entered the structure of a man's life. If the rule is always noble in thought, but absent in the day, identity has not yet settled. If action still waits for permission from mood, command is still weak. But if action still appears on the day your mood disappears, then something has changed at the level that matters. Identity becomes real when action still appears on the day your mood disappears. All of it leads back to one final principle. Final closing standard, oath, all of it leads back to one final principle. A man will not control every mood. He will not control every tired morning, every crowded afternoon, every night where the mind feels overused, every hour where reluctance speaks in a persuasive voice. That was never the promise. The promise was never emotional perfection. The promise was stronger command. Mood will still exist. Discomfort will still exist. Fatigue will still exist. Inner resistance will still speak. But command no longer belongs to whatever speaks the loudest inside the moment. That is the shift. Reliability is not discovered in a rare feeling. It is chosen in rulership. It is chosen when a man decides what leads before the day begins testing him. It is chosen when the standard keeps its authority on days that do not feel noble. It is chosen when the weaker self loses some of its editing rights. It is chosen when action stops waiting for emotional permission to become real. And there is peace in that. Not easy peace, not lazy peace, the peace of no longer reopening what should already be decided. The peace of not having to rebuild yourself from nothing each morning. The peace of knowing that mood is part of your experience, but no longer the author of your standards. That is where this whole movement has been pointing. Not toward hardness for its own sake, not toward numbness, not toward self-punishment dressed up as discipline, toward order, toward self-respect, toward a life that holds. Because the man inside it has stopped surrendering command to weather. From here on, the rule is simple: standards first. Command stays with the standard. Reliability becomes identity. Mood can speak, but it does not lead. If you're done letting mood lead, leave a like. Subscribe for the next chapter.